Well, welcome all to the Resilience Through Catastrophe, Preparation for and Recovery from Climate Disaster panel. I'm Tony McQuail from Ontario, from Meeting Place Organic Farm. I'm involved with the Holistic Management Canada, Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario, the National Farmers Union, and now a new group that brings together 27 progressive farm organizations across Canada, the Farmers for Climate Solutions. So I think we've seen the illustration of the importance of the many different hats many of us wear and the importance of working together, and I suspect that will be an ongoing theme of our presentation and panel this afternoon. So I'd like to introduce the panelists. We have Paula Garcia, who's the Executive Director of the New Mexico Garcia Association, a statewide organization of acequias, which are communal water systems for irrigation and traditional agriculture. Paula has worked for over 25 years to strengthen acequia water governance and local food systems. In recent years, Paula has worked intensively and tirelessly on disaster recovery and disaster planning following the 2022 wildfires, the largest on record in New Mexico. She works with her extended family on a small ranch in Mora County. Welcome, Paula. Well, Paula, we're going to speed things, I'm going to introduce everybody at once, and then they'll come and do about an 8-minute presentation. And then following the completion of those three, we'll go into a conversation and then some questions. Torri Estrada is the co-founder and executive director of the Carbon Cycle Institute and directs its policy and climate justice work. Torri has worked to advance solutions to social and environmental justice, climate, and natural resource issues for over 30 years. Torri holds an MS in environmental sociology and policy with environmental justice and community development emphasis from the University of Michigan. Welcome, Torri. And Brian Wehlburg is a certified educator with both Holistic Management International and the Savory Institute. Brian delivers holistic management training through the company Inside Outside Management. Brian is on the board of Holistic Management International, as well as the chair of the Australian Holistic Management Cooperative, which manages the Ecological Outcomes Verifications Program on almost 2 million acres. Welcome, Brian. And Torri, I'll turn it over, or sorry, Paula, I will turn it over to you.
Hey, buenas tardes, les de Dios. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Paula Garcia, and it's great to be here. And this is an amazing conference. It's my first time. I think some people are surprised to hear that I hadn't been to a Regenerate conference, and I'm absolutely awestruck by the whole thing. I come from Mora, New Mexico, and I'm considered, part of my bio is that I'm raised in part of a small ranch with my extended family, and my goddaughter's with me today, who actually runs more cattle than I do, but my Christina Garcia. And you know, my dad considers me somewhat of a bad rancher, because he said, "Oh, tú te querencias mucho con los animales." He's like, you get too attached to your animals, so it's impossible to generate any profit at our household. So I come to you with that lack of credential about ranching. But I've been working with the New Mexico Acequia Association for over 25 years, and we're an organization that works with acequias, which are the community-based irrigation systems, and we consider an acequia a community. A lot of times we'll visualize an irrigation ditch, but when we use the word acequia in our language, we're referring to the community of people. So you would say, yo pertenezco a la acequia, I belong to the acequia. And the acequia is the community of people. But it's also the waterway that brings water from a common source, a river, ultimately from the watershed, or from the springs that bring water into the Sequía Madre, or the mother ditch, and then it's spread to all the farmland that we irrigate together. And we have to cooperate with each other through the customary practices of the repartimiento, which is a sharing tradition, to make sure that water is equitably shared among the people. So we have a very intimate relationship with our watershed, with our rivers. If you are a mayordomo or mayordoma, you have to understand the way that your watershed behaves when there's snow melt, or there's a rainstorm. And you also have to understand the personalities of your people on your acequia. And you do your best to keep the peace. And we've been doing this for centuries. And it's a very, it's a beautiful tradition, but I also don't want to romanticize it. It's very challenging, and it keeps you on your toes. And I think that's part of our resiliency, because we're always constantly adapting to developing conditions and parameters. So even in normal, what we call normal times, sharing scarce water can be very challenging. And we're facing the greatest challenges in our centuries of history here in New Mexico. First with mega drought, which many of you have seen the studies about this past couple of years being the worst in 1,200 years. So from my own experience, we've been experiencing some intense drought since the mid-90s. I remember that because I moved home from college to grow gardens. My parents thought I was crazy. I do have an uncle who's in a mental hospital, and they said, oh, Paula's on her way there with Uncle Louis, because he moved home to cut and sell firewood, and then I moved home to grow gardens, and they're like, okay, I think we're seeing a pattern here. And so I can remember that right at the time I went home, serious drought was underway. And so what I want to talk to you about today is the work we're doing in the context of that greater climate crisis, and what the work we've been doing to be more resilient in that way from an intergenerational standpoint, but also the recent fires of 2022. And I'm always saying that there was our life before the fire, then there's our life after the fire. That is the marker in our lifetime that separates a more stable time to a time of greater instability, and a test of our resiliency. So I've been working on disaster recovery since the 2022 fires. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with what happened in 2022, but we had the worst wildfire season in New Mexico history. And I am from Mora, and the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon fire burned about 340,000 acres, like 50 square miles. You have to drive almost 2 hours to see it end to end. It's our homeland that burned. And we had been in the same area for 8 generations, farming and ranching. And my goddaughter, who's here, was putting out spot fires and saved our houses and barns. But the forest around us did burn. What we're seeing after that, other than the trauma of seeing these beautiful places in your homeland burn, on a very personal standpoint, how to keep your household going and your livelihood, and then how do we heal the landscape? How do we endure and keep living there in the face of recurring flooding from these burn scars, and also stabilizing your life and your family? And that's extremely challenging. So that's really shaped my life in the last 2 years. And within my capacity with the Acequia Association, we had to quickly adapt to a completely different landscape. And I'm sorry that I don't have visuals today, but if follow with me, just imagine living in a village where you have a gentle little acequia flowing that comes from snowmelt, and then you just get the most modest rainstorm, not a big rainstorm, and all of a sudden you're dealing with 2,000 CFS of black water coming down a canyon that didn't used to run before, and it wipes out everything. And it doesn't just take out the acequia from the side, it takes it from all directions and then deposits ash and rock all over the fields. So this is what we're dealing with. The water brings down trees that look like tumbleweeds and boulders that are 6 feet long, and then just leaving it in the fields. And we can't cut hay, we can't grow pasture like we used to. But what we've been doing in the past 2 years has been to organize around debris removal. But 1 year in, we're just getting into the watershed planning piece of work. There are some really good groups that are already doing some watershed restoration, like Hermit's Peak Watershed Alliance. I'm sure you've heard of them. They're doing some green infrastructure, things like One Rock check dams, weir structures, anything to control erosion along the slopes, and they're doing that on a small scale, but we definitely want to scale it up. And in the Mora side, we're doing a river stewardship program grant that we got from the state to start doing some watershed restoration there, but this is a very small scale. We're doing a NRCS watershed operations program effort. We just completed what's called a preliminary investigation that's going to do a 10-year project to do some watershed restoration. So we're still doing debris removal on about 70 acequias, and each acequia we're working with a variety of different disaster agencies, but then we're also trying to do the proactive planning, looking into the future about healing the watershed. So there are really two parallel tracks that have to happen at the same time. We have to do the recovery and stabilize people's lives where they're living around their home, in their field, in their acequia, over and over and over again every time it floods. And then we also have to work collectively to heal the watershed. And it's on such a large scale that it's very daunting. But seeing how people have responded, the kind of support that we're getting has given me a lot of hope. And I'm happy to talk about that more if we have a chance. Thank you very much. Que vivan las acequias!
Well, thanks for having me here. Our role, so again, I'm Torri Estrada with the Carbon Cycle Institute. We're based in California. So my role in this panel today is we don't do post-disaster work. What I would like to say is we do is try to build resilience in agricultural systems. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of our role in that piece of it. So I'm going to provide California context here. So what does resilience mean and what are we being resilient against? And as you can imagine in the Southwest, but also in California, we're dealing with multiple expressions of the kind of rolling climate disasters. I don't want to downplay California's had its fires, and it's important to focus on that, but we're also dealing with, over time, this rolling temporal disaster in terms of like drought is actually having an enormous impact. So the farmers and ranchers we work with are dealing with multiple climate disasters happening over different timescales. And most of California's agriculture, by any quantitative or qualitative measure, is dealing with a high level of vulnerability. So how do you step into that system and try to humbly build resilience is really the endeavor here. So our role at the Carbon Cycle Institute, again being modest, is, if I could wrap up what we try to do, is trying to build up the capacity at a local and regional level to respond to the scale of climate disaster, focus on agricultural landscapes. So in the sort of climate parlance, I think in agricultural systems, I think we're looking at both adaptation and mitigation. And in the agricultural sectors, those things are very related. So we can do and implement landscape scale changes that deal with adaptation, so they're trying to build long-term resilience, but we're also trying to deal with the causes of climate change, which is addressing greenhouse gases and the role of natural landscapes in that. And for our part, we feel like the on-farm planning, both that happens on individual farms, but at the watershed scale, is a really important piece of building that sort of long-term ability to think about planning and adaptive management over time. That's what we're going to need over time to be able to respond to the climate disaster. So again, our work is not single practice, and it's not short term. We're looking at decadal work that's looking at multiple landscape, soil and land management efforts. And when we do this right, we actually are addressing other issues around groundwater sustainability, biodiversity, water quality, and other issues. So for us, the farm scale, and then sort of looking at farm scale across the watershed, is actually an important piece of the solution set when we think about climate change. And these are just, and many people here work in this area, but just sort of looking at the sort of multiple benefits we get when we think about landscapes and improving land and soil management over time. So I would say, and I'm going to talk about more about one piece of it, this is only one piece of building resilience in the face of climate disasters, that we believe adaptive management has got to be an ongoing tool that we invest in, and then the role of planning and technical assistance over time. So in essence, I would say that most of the agricultural work we're doing in the climate sector is really about addressing uncertainty, understanding that context, working with producers to understand the economic reality, the agronomic reality of their business, but also trying to figure out how to deal with that uncertainty. So farm planning is really critical. One piece of it, I think, in California we're trying to deal with, since we're thinking about long-term changes on landscape, is the ability to build an infrastructure that's actually ground up around monitoring, ongoing monitoring. So like having the data to understand where you are in terms of resiliency and able to respond to different climate disasters, whether it be a one-year drought, fire that's in your landscape, or sort of systemic issues around long-term drought that we're seeing there. And one thing, and we'll talk about a little bit, that I think it's been really critical for us is I think in many of those discussions, it's believed that sort of a technical expert comes and talks to you about this, and that's not our experience. I think what we've seen flourish at the local level is the ability to share knowledge and interventions between land managers, producers, and conservation organizations. That sort of building up that level of infrastructure, knowledge sharing, has actually been what's made the difference in terms of what you want to call in terms of innovation, but also long-term commitment to solutions that we need to address the climate disaster. So one small piece that Carbon Cycle Institute's been working with is that we're actually now have launched 7 regional hubs covering 40 counties across California. And we're intentionally doing that because what we've heard at a local level is that we can't actually address these issues farm by farm. We actually have to work at the scale to be able to address these because the solutions are beyond, in some ways, what we could do at the farm level. So we're essentially building up an infrastructure, long-term infrastructure, to sort of have the capacity to do this adaptive management. So bring together all sort of traditional technical service organizations along with conservation organizations, but also building capacity among producers to be able to step in and do their own peer-to-peer learning and to drive the process as well. I think that's a really important piece of this. Again, this is not short-term work, it's actually long-term work. So these are just a few of the things I think our regional hubs are trying to do, and the one thing I would accentuate is one of the challenges, I think, in California, where we have a very, in some ways, top-down climate policy and programs coming down, and a lot of it legitimate because fire has been so disastrous, the state has responded. But what's lacking is sort of the understanding of what's needed at the local level and how the programs and funding actually need to come down. So building the sort of scale of local institutions who not only do land management at the local level, but begin to communicate proactively at the state and federal level about what we need in a more robust way. And then one thing I'll hopefully get to talk about a little bit that we're doing, which I think is exciting, and this is really a California context, I hope it will scale, is in California we do a lot of local level climate planning, mostly focused on urban greenhouse gases. We are now developing sort of bottom-up agricultural community-led responses to climate, including resilience. So what this is a voluntary planning process where farmers and ranchers are at the center of the discussion to develop goals, strategies, and actions that then get sort of operationalized at the county and state level. And to date, agriculture has really been missing from that conversation and building the capacity to be driving at a local level. So that's one thing I'll hopefully get to talk about today. And then at the state level, we're trying to push down resources and planning down to the local level. It's a lot has been top level, but just sort of say that on the policy level at the state of California, really trying to bring the resources down to provide the capacity for ongoing planning and adaptive management. So looking forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everybody. Brian Wehlburg from Australia. Oops, thank you, sir. I think I stage bombed the presentation in Denver last year, and this is my punishment. But thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to come up and have a chat. So I love this little statement on the thing there. Make your visions so clear that your fears disappear. Fear makes us crouch down and freeze. And I think it aligns very closely with a statement that I think came from around here somewhere. I had a dream. And again, we need to make that a holistic dream where we encourage people as well as environment to make that happen. So just for your interest, I'm a third-born Zimbabwean. For those of you, whoops, how do we make it? How do we make the video run? Oh, there we go. Yep. Anyway, folks, for those of you who don't know where that's interesting. For those of you who don't know where Zimbabwe is, Southern Africa, a little landlocked country in Southern Africa. I was, as I said, third-born generation there, and my dad had been a tobacco farmer all his life. Tobacco was the big industry in what was then Rhodesia. I think after the Second World War, the Poms couldn't afford to buy expensive American tobacco, so they set out looking in the colonies to find out where they could grow reasonable quality tobacco. So as a country, we used to vie with Brazil to be the biggest flue-cured tobacco suppliers in the world, exporters in the world. And so it was a very buzzy industry to be in. Can I?
Brian, you'll have to hold the mic either close to your mouth.
Okay, we'll stand up there. My apologies. Is the PowerPoint working? Oh, okay, cool. We'll skip the video. Yeah, yep. Thank you. You got it? Okay. Can we just skip the video? Thank you. Okay. Right, we're there. I suppose this is where my interest in resilience came in. Tobacco, huge input crop, and I suppose we headed towards that organic sort of look to tobacco. So we built bat houses, we used livestock, we had chickens providing fertility. Not that I'm suggesting for a minute tobacco and organic should be linked, but I probably became the only organic tobacco producer in the country. But my big passion has always been the wildlife. So we ended up with 100,000 acres of what we call conservancy, which was wildlife. We operated hunting as well as tourism. And one of the things with the wildlife industry, even still today, when you have crisis, when you have catastrophe, you have fires, you have droughts, you have floods, your animals die and die and die. There's just no ways you can get out there and feed monkeys, baboons, elephants, leopards, lions, all that kind of stuff. So your animals perish. And then the sad thing is when the seasons come back good, which they always will do, you can't just go down to your local sale yards and purchase yourself a couple of elephants and giraffe and stuff. So that idea of building resilience back into the landscapes became a key driver for me. And that's where I got involved with Alan Savory's work and holistic management and helping, especially using animals as a tool to help create that resilience in those landscapes. So very intensive sort of stuff, moving animals sometimes between 40 and 80 times a day, and running just over 10,000 paddocks to make that change, but creating amazing resilience. The country itself went through some serious crisis, and again, we'd made a big decision to move to Australia. And as you can appreciate, that's that little island down there on the bottom of the globe. All my children have $1 trillion notes, Zimbabwe dollar notes. I left $80,000 in the country to go back on holiday, and my father-in-law 2 years later said he had just paid $80,000 for a bunch of grapes. The country went into catastrophic collapse. And again, resiliency paid through. Going into Australia, we ended up at, I just want to mention actually, those good folks in New Zealand. You know, the world map, we tend to look at it like this. And for those flat earthers, you know, New Zealand is sort of slipping off the edge. But fortunately, we know it's round. But being in Australia, you know, that's the world view. This is the Australian-New Zealand view, which actually gives us a great advantage because, you know, we can just do stuff. Yeah, we're in charge. So, you know, that's where the Australian view and New Zealand view comes in. But we landed up in central Queensland on some big cattle stations, and already these folks were doing some amazing work. So really progressive farmers there. And so we slotted right in, which was fantastic. But after about 8-9 years there, my kids, 3 kids, started going to school, and that was a 9-hour drive. So we decided to pack up there, and having been born in hot, dry Central Africa, moving to hot, dry, red Central Queensland, we found paradise, which was on the New South Wales coast. 4 feet of rain a year, guaranteed an inch a month. You know, you dig a hole, beautiful clear water comes out the ground. You walk through the forest, you can pick mandarins and lemons, fantastic. And then you discover ticks and leeches and copper deficiencies. And, you know, every area has its pros and cons, and we just got to learn to manage them. The pigs are cute, yeah, had nothing to do with pigs. Had nothing to do with pigs. But that whole pig nest there is a thing called blady grass, which, you know, the farmers cursed and cussed and burnt and poisoned. The pigs did a real fine job of cleaning it up for us. So we did a lot of pigs, we did cattle, we did pastured eggs, and boxed beef into Sydney and Brisbane and a few other places. That's my better half, Kerry. We did a lot of farmers markets, which again, great place to connect and build community and tell your story. You know, we've heard, I think that's been the theme through certainly all the discussions I've heard today. It's all about creating a story and sharing. So again, farmers markets were a great way of helping share our story. But all the stories from the farm as well were a great advantage when trying to convince other people and run the training. So, you know, we run training courses all over Australia, and a lot of the stories from the farm help get people to look at possibly another way of managing. So we run as I mentioned, we run the company Inside Outside Management. We develop training all over Australia in holistic management. Currently I have one project in Western Australia, just to give you an idea of the scale of things. 7 properties, just over 5 million acres. The one property, their driveway is 100 kilometres. I always say to folks, you know, pack a lunch if you're taking the kids to the bus stop. But all based around Alan Savory's thinking and holistic management as a framework for helping make better decisions. You know, when we look around the world today and the loss of resilience and the problems we see, you know, today we have more technology at our fingertips than at any time in human history. Today we have more knowledge about the human gut biome, space, soils, that again, in any time in human history, but our environments are deteriorating at a faster and faster rate. So it's more about our thinking and our decision making than a lack of technology or knowledge. We have huge amounts of knowledge. How do we turn that into decision making? And that's where holistic management comes in. Just as a quick aside, TAFE is a technical college, and again, we were very lucky to get holistic management into TAFE. It's Australia-wide, and we developed a nationally accredited diploma in holistic management. So any school leavers wanting to get a degree in agriculture or agricultural business studies could do it through us as a starting point and get credited units. And then more recently, a couple of universities have come on board, and again, especially Southern Cross University, who've developed a degree in regenerating agriculture. And I was very specific there with that word regenerating. I'm really trying to push away from regenerator to regenerating, because that becomes a verb. I reckon, and I believe, that we will have new methods, new ways of doing things that are going to develop in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years that we haven't even dreamt of. And the minute we fix it as a regenerative agriculture, it becomes a thing. Rather talk about regenerating agriculture, then we're accepting all these new technologies, ideas, methodologies that are going to come our way. So looking forward to having a chat and sharing some ideas, and thanks for hearing a bit of my story. Thanks very much.
Well, Paula, Torri, and Brian, you've all come from places that have experienced wildfires and flooding and that sort of thing, and I'd be interested to know what you see as the things that help a community be more resilient before, and what are the things that really help after those kind of situations. So whoever would like to go first?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. Good question. And I can speak from my own experience. And I've worked, in the past 2 years, on 3 major fires: the Hermes Peak Calf Canyon, the Black Fire, and the Cerro Pelado. And the first thing that we did was because we were not prepared. I'm going to say that right now. I'm not going to pretend that we had any preparation whatsoever. And I take a special responsibility for that because I was a county commissioner for 8 years. And I'm very well aware of the fact that we never did any disaster planning. It wasn't for lack of an intent, but we just didn't have the resources. So there was no disaster planning. And I also want to go further to say that there hasn't been any climate resiliency planning in my area either. So we're talking about a very poor rural area of New Mexico. And New Mexico is a limited resource state overall, but this is a very limited resource rural area of New Mexico. So the first thing I think that we had to do from a land-based perspective, and I'm coming from the agricultural community, from the acequias, is that we didn't even have any kind of formal inventory of the agricultural resources in our 2 counties. There wasn't any geospatial data. You know, I was watching your slides and thinking, wow, that would have been nice. We didn't have any geospatial data other than what was being put together by the Forest Service so we could track the progress of the fire. But it was almost like we were invisible. And we had to create our own maps very quickly. In fact, the fire was it's such a big fire that you could go into an area that was a month old that had already gone out, and there was still a fire burning on this other side. So where the fire was cool, we went in and we are starting to map once it was cool enough. So the first thing we did was map. So that's thing number 1, map. Get your lay of the land, really develop an understanding of what's in your community. And we did that when the fire was still hot and cooling off. I wish we had done it 10 years ago. So if I were to go into a community now and say, look, you're probably going to have some kind of disaster in the next 10 to 20 years, you should definitely map all your areas and understand what you have and what's at risk. And I've learned that there are a lot of analytical tools to understand based on slopes and things like that, you know, where the flooding's going to be worse. There's models that can generate inundation maps. That would have all been pretty handy, you know, before all the flooding happened. And so I think local governments, soil and water conservation districts can bring those kind of resources into the community to do that kind of work. From the acequia standpoint, and I'll just end with this, the relationships are really important. And in the course of mapping, and I'm glad I did it, and I spent a lot of my own time, we brought in some people that were GIS experienced, you know, people that could go out in the field. They were people that did wilderness trails. And they came in as contractors and did mapping of acequias for us. So it was the same skill set, which I didn't have, but I personally spent time in the field because I wanted to look people, face to face, check in on them, and really realize that what we did have going for us is that there were relationships in the community. Every acequia has an elected body and members. So really affirming that and telling people like this is really going to be important in the next 10 to 20 years as we recover. And just affirming that for people, get your documents in order. Here's a map, and that's empowering. And then it sounds very basic or dry, but we started to have workshops and meetings where people could talk and see each other face to face and talk about their challenges. And it's a work in progress, but it was a very steep learning curve, like after the climate disaster that we had, to learn what different agencies do. And as much as I wanted to say, no, we're a strong, resilient people, we'll heal the land ourselves, like that's impossible. This takes too much. It takes too much in terms of resources to do this. We need a massive infusion of resources for recovery. And you kind of have to surrender to these bureaucracies a little bit, I come from a different, like a radical political positionality of myself, thinking that, we're self-determination and self-sufficiency and all this. And it was hard to surrender to say like, okay, we're going to develop a good working relationship with FEMA and Homeland Security and all of these agencies, and we have done that, but it was a steep learning curve. Again, I wish we would have done that 10 years ago. But the work now is still very raw. We're still digging ourselves out and making plans for the next 10 years of erosion control measures, trying to stop the head cuts on our streams and re-engage with the floodplain. I mean, such fundamental repairs like Band-Aids. To think like a gazillion Band-Aids on the land with rocks. And that's on the level that we're thinking. And it's hard for me to separate before and after, because everything we're doing now, I wish we would have started 10 years ago. So it's kind of the same before and after. It's the same kind of work, the same cadence, and you don't want to get stuck unprepared. But if you're unprepared, you still manage. You still step up and do what has to be done. So, yeah.
I'll make some brief comments. I think in a landscape like California, what I would generally say, just as a context setting, is that the capacity pre or post is uneven, right? I would say there are examples of communities that were, at least, and just tagging off what you said, kind of had a sense of what the scale of potential disaster could happen, had the analytical tools, had institutions, and then the sort of boundaries of the disaster, like particularly fires in Northern California, totally exceeded what anybody could model out. So it's important, I think, to have the tools. But I think, at least in California, we see this sort of blowing the boundaries of like what people could not only understand, but then what you can organize for. But what I would say, both in the fire and drought examples, is that you have some interesting responses. So one thing in California we have now, they did exist before, were fire safe councils. I think with the impact of the fires, those councils have been more empowered. So one thing I would say that's a possibility, to tag off what Paula said, is I think there's a growing recognition of the need to have local people actually driving those processes at a very deeper level. And I'm not even talking about the analytical stuff. It's sort of what we alluded to, is sort of around decision making, because it's going to have to be, most of these landscapes are privately owned. So you have a level of cooperation and a level of decision making, and that can't always be driven by institutions at a higher level. So just an example of fire safe councils, I think, have been a really interesting experiment in sort of not only building technical capacity, but figuring out how to make decision-making and who needs to be leading on different efforts. The one other thing I think and I'll end there, that we've learned is sort of, even though if we can be prepared ahead of disaster, and in California we have long-term planning also around drought, so these are not responding to specific necessarily disasters, but sort of long-term planning. We have a lot of programs around that. The one thing I think we're really struggling with is sort of like post-disaster, the lack of infrastructure, even plant material, planning, workforce to actually do the restoration work. And some of that work can be done on farms privately, but frankly, the scale of it is too large. That's something I think we're really struggling with now, is sort of like, how do you build a sort of long-term infrastructure, including workforce, that's going to have to be engaged in this. I think that's the thing we're learning now, and I think is aligned from local government up to state government, but also stakeholders is sort of like, oh, it's not just disaster response, but the restoration of watershed and landscape is actually the next stage. And we're not really organized for that. We actually don't even have the capital for that at the scale that we need to be thinking about. So just a few comments there.
Thanks, Tony. I think I'll just focus on community for a while. I think most farmers go farming because they don't want to talk to people. But at the end of the day, you know, your biggest asset, I think, as a farmer is your neighbor. And we like to think our fences and boundary fences are some kind of barrier. You know, holistically, we know that's not true. Birds, bees, mice, all those kind of things float through your fences, as well as sometimes your livestock. And again, so having a good relationships with your neighbors is critically important. You know, if I said to folks, you know, who would invest in a town where everybody was 90 years old and an accountant? Yeah, you wouldn't be very resilient, and it'd be a short-lived sort of investment. So again, you know, what can we do as individuals to encourage community? Not just community with nature, but community within the humans. And we need that diversity of community. So again, having a vision of what that looks like for yourself and your family will help drive your decisions to create a community that has resilience. Because when you go through a catastrophe, you know, there probably won't be a medical service for you to call on. There may not even be a chemist shop, a pharmacy down the road. It's going to be the neighbor who comes along, and hopefully they can stitch you up at the end of the day when you have something catastrophic strike you. So, you know, being really proactive about building community within your neighbors, your networks, is a really great way of creating resilience. And you know, all around the world we see those communities that have good social connections within their community are the ones that survive catastrophes every time, hands down. So what can we do to be proactive in helping create those communities? Because I think technology in a large way has severed a lot of those links. I know in Australia, you know, you go along to a cattle sale, and in the old days you'd go to the pub afterwards and have a couple of beers with your mates and tell stories. You know, the law doesn't allow us that to happen today, so everybody goes home and carries on working. We need to be proactive about building community if we're going to generate social resilience in the landscape.
Well, Brian just pulled into something I wanted to do to the audience, which is to ask a couple questions to you as we go on here. And that is, I'd like, as you've been hearing this and thinking about it, what you as individuals or teams going back into your community can do when you get home to strengthen that community around your individual property as part of the move to resilience. And also to think about what messages do I need to be taking back to my non-brittle, wet environment in Ontario to talk to my council about how we can be better prepared and start building things. So I hope each of you will think on both what can you do at the personal level within your own immediate geographic community, but also what can you do in terms of thinking about helping your region or your municipality be better prepared. Because what I'm hearing from Paula is, wish we'd done this 10 years ago. Didn't have that option. But maybe some of us have a 10-year lead time or a 2-year lead time, and the time to work on it is now. So that's the second question. If you could tell, and I'm going to start with Brian, I think this time, if you could tell a regional government or something how they could prepare or what they need to have in their arsenal or their toolbox for after a disaster, what would you be telling them to think about and prepare now? And then we'll come back through Torri to Paula.
Fantastic, thanks. So again, I think diversity within communities, diversity within landscapes will create that resilience which allows people and environments to step back up after a catastrophe. Just a property I was working on, most properties in Australia today, you can get 4 times a year soil surface percentages. And just a property I was working with there, they brought the property, changed management, and literally year on year, their soil cover just improved dramatically. And 2019, they had a huge fire, and the graph dropped right back down to baseline again. But the really interesting thing was, because they had been working towards that soil cover and resilience, after the fire, literally within a year, they were back up there on the graph again. And I thought, wow. I share pictures of satellite imagery of Yellowstone National Park after the big fires there in '88. And today you can still see the fire scars there. So is that really resilient country that's going to bounce back really quickly after a catastrophic event? How can we build resilience back in the landscape? And possibly using low-cost tools that reproduce themselves is a great way of doing it. So yep, on both of those.
I guess from my experience, which is California-based, I feel I think it's difficult because at one level, I feel like local government should be playing a heightened role, but in some ways, at least from the California experience, I don't think local government actually has the set of tools it needs, actually, in the staffing. I can go on and on about that. So I think what's happened in California, and again, it's uneven, I think what's been a constant message to local government is within existing land use planning, existing climate planning, which we have a lot of, is that resilience is now a leading sort of outcome that we're planning for. But I think what we've been telling local government is sort of to this point is top-down planning, there's a role for it at some scale, but what we really need over time is actually bottom-up. We actually need local community institutions that are stronger. We need stronger relationships, and that is sort of happening. So just one example, our Office of Planning at the state level is actually pushing funding down to local governments to actually do resiliency planning. Most counties are actually hiring consultants to do that. Generic planning, like here's your laundry list. No ownership, local level, no real action. And so trying to figure out how to do this from bottom up, and I think it has to be, so what I would say is a county doesn't have to lead that effort, but it actually has to empower and actually fund a network, a coalition of community organizations that have pieces of that. Could be the public health piece, the land use piece, and the agriculture piece. That's some of the work we've been doing, and I think it's really exciting to spend the time, have the capacity to set goals, strategies, and planning. It's not going to prevent things, but I think it's enabling local community institutions. And in the ag sector, I think there are institutions to build on. In our state, our resource conservation districts, cooperative extension, along with water districts, there is actually stakeholders that can come together and actually do that. So that's been our message to local government, is sort of empower local institutions, bring more landowners and producers into that, and think about how to build the capacity of them to not only just be participating, but actually leading those efforts, defining the strategies across farm landscapes that can work. That's what's going to, I think, work long term.
I think from my experience, we're still we're still in shock. So it's hard to look at that question objectively, well, what should you do post-disaster? But I can tell you that a lot of what's been said so far really resonates with me about the importance of bottom-up and building capacity. And at least in a place like Mora and San Miguel County, Those institutions don't have the capacity to do this type of work or to think on this kind of scale. We're dealing with like landscape that's multi-jurisdictional, and in my experience, the counties had their hands full just to dealing with roads and bridges. And I saw it all. Like, I kept a journal. I can tell you, like, first you had this Forest Service bear team come in, burned area emergency something. And you learn all these acronyms, you have to learn the acronyms. And then this other team came, incident command team came in. That came and went. And this whole time you're getting dizzy. You're like, okay, this is the structure. We're going to latch onto this. And it comes and goes, and then we're still there. The community's still there. And so I would just say it's really good, keep up with those things, but they're sort of distractions. We spent way too much time chasing those little pieces of top-down government kind of mandates. They're written into law, these things happen, but they don't have an impact. They result in a report or a document, and that didn't help us. What did help us was guys with backhoes, guys with tools that went out and helped their neighbors. That's what really made the difference in our communities. And with the Acequia example, again, we're still doing debris removal. That means we're still digging out. We're still digging out from ash and sediment and woody debris that's coming down off of what used to be a forest. And the partnerships that we've created, we've had to get very creative about being open-minded and not being like, well, no, FEMA is too bureaucratic, forget them. Like, okay, we can use the money, FEMA, but can we spend it the way we want to spend it? And that was what we had to do. And I feel like we made progress. It sounds very Pollyanna, but because we had a governor who was very supportive. I want to do a shout out for Michelle Lujan Grisham, our governor, because she stood up for Mora. She said, you know what? There is no way these Mora County acequias or the county or any institution in Mora can pay for their recovery up front and get reimbursed. So the state had to step in and say, we're going to front the money, and we trust these people. They're trying, and we're going to make sure that they get some resources up front without red tape, and then the state's dealing with FEMA. And or whatever program, USDA emergency watershed program, these kinds of things. And in every instance, we have had to build, so we had to have some collective effort and understanding of how we wanted the work to be done. And then we had to earn the trust of government officials to say, hey, these are people from the community, they have a plan, let's take a chance on them. And so I feel like we're able to, tweak these programs around the edges enough with some wiggle room to make them work the way we need them to work. But it boiled down to relationships across laterally, horizontally in the community so that everyone felt like they have a voice. But then we also had to learn how to navigate with agencies and build relationships there. They're just people too, And a lot of these FEMA or NRCS people, that's their passion project, These people love disasters and trying to be of service. And so kind of seeing people for the human beings that they are, wanting to be of service and saying like, well, hey, we're in the same boat. Let's try to get some work done here. So that's where we're at right now. But it took a lot of good faith on all sides, multilateral.
Thanks, Paula. How much time do we have? We're pretty well out, right? 2 minutes? Okay. Well, one of the things I'd like to say in listening to it is we often say when we're teaching a course, you are the expert on your farm. You can get experts coming in also, but you're the expert, you're the person there on the ground. And I think we need to also take that message back to our communities. We are the experts in our communities. And thinking about starting to think like a watershed, not just a farm in a watershed, but how do we link those things up? Because in hearing what you're saying, I think one of the things I feel so positive about regenerative agriculture is that if we strengthen our farm ecosystems from the ground up in terms of soil health, and then we connect that beyond our fence lines with our neighbors and build that kind of resilience, we'll hold water better during regular rains or torrential rains, which reduce flooding risk, but it also means we've got more moisture in the soil after a fire disaster, and those deep roots and adventitious buds can come up much more quickly. So, to me, not only is community important, but the health of the environment. And does that resonate with you? You just have to put up your hands because we're out of time to give you all a chance to talk. But does that make sense in terms of, and it's a positive thing that we can do now that benefits us as landowners, but that will also benefit us as communities if down the road we are the unfortunate people that FEMA wants to rush in and help because they love disasters. No, don't come visit me, please. But, that aspect of strengthening what we have now to be better prepared both at the community level but from the soil up. But does that resonate? Does that work? You're going to make audience participation.
Is there a difference between the environment and people?
No. So we have to do both. Do them all. And you're right. They're all interconnected. Okay. Anyone last words? And let's wrap it up. Do we have time for questions? Okay. Questions from the audience. Go raise your hand and grab a mic.
All right. I see some people.
Okay, my name is Brian Hummel. I actually work for the Environmental Protection Agency. I've done a lot of work for FEMA. So I really like what you said about building the soil, building the sponge, and basically using regenerative ag to turn flooding liabilities into biologically filtered groundwater assets, especially if you can do it at enhanced agricultural profit. You had mentioned some of the things you would suggest for a community to do beforehand, and that I really think you just need to have your vision. Have your vision written down, have your vision that the community accepts, and then be ready to cut and paste. So when those RFPs come out for funding, you just cut and paste your vision into the format that the grants, need, and put as many hooks in the water as possible. Find the people in your community that are reasonable at writing grants, and give them tasks and say, write this, because the money's going to be there and our government's going to spend this once-in-a-generation investment, and we're going to spend it on good projects or bad projects. So people that are working on good projects, put your hook in the water.
Thank you for sharing, Guy here, fellow Australian, so good to see you up there. I've got a question. You all touched a little bit on what to me is like institutional congestion, where you've got those big structures that are bound by red tape. I'm interested from a bottom-up and grassroots perspective, if you can tell a little bit more about the power that communities and farmers actually have, because I know that institutions are bound by a number of different things, but for a perspective of empowerment, what is it that we can do that your institutions can't, and how can we understand that value better?
I think I understood the question, and one thing I haven't mentioned that I think we'll touch on your question a little bit is the importance of advocacy. That you have at the grassroots level, landowners, the farmers, ranchers, people who own forested land and all of that, who of course can do a lot of things on their own and their own land and across fence lines with their community to improve resiliency. And when a disaster happens, I think that if you have to organize after the disaster and build, common ground and understanding about how you think this response should be going better in recovery, it's going to be hard to, you can organize in a crisis. Sometimes the crisis is the impetus that gets people to organizing, but if if there's already structures in place or potential to have a collective voice, that way a lot of what you'll have to deal with is communicating to these larger structures that have their constraints. And if they're hearing 100 different farmers saying 100 different things, they're going to just resort to their top-down ways of doing things. But if collectively you can come up with alternatives that are realistic and kind of can work within their constraints, or give them some options for how they can go a little bit out, color outside the lines a little bit, they're much more likely to show some flexibility if it looks like the collective of farmers and ranchers and landowners are like-minded, and have some ideas, have a plan, have a vision, as opposed to trying to do that all in the fog of a disaster. So being ready to advocate and have an advocacy voice when that disaster happens is really important. Pre-disaster, but also after disaster, I think is helpful. So.
Yeah, thanks very much, Paula. Just adding on to that, I think regenerating farmers, we're all excited about what we're doing. We all see a positive side to this. And so I find everywhere regenerative farmers are open. They want to share, they want to create their own communities. We don't have to wait for governments or councils to create those communities, because we're so open. We want to share, we want to tell people about it. Whereas, I've been to a lot of industrial pig places and rose growing places, and I mean, you got a sign before they'll even let you through the boom at the front gate. Whereas I find generally people looking towards regenerating their land, their communities, very, very open, very excited about what they're doing. And so they build their own communities very quickly.
Just one quick thing, and I won't generalize this, but just my experience in California from climate planning. It's not a bad thing, but it's the downside of averages. So if you look across the California landscape and you think about solutions, what we get for efficiency is generic solutions. And so to answer your question, the role of farmer or land manager is you can use those guidelines, but you actually need to understand the variability. And I don't mean to be scientific, but like averages don't work. Doesn't work on a particular farm, doesn't work across farms. So it's the ground truthing, if you're really doing great science and planning, you actually need that. You need the input from farmers who understand not only what solutions will work, but how they work at scale, right? It's like the ingredients. And so I think from California perspective, that's what's missing. It's like generic planning only can go so far. You actually have to have not only the data, but then you have to have the buy-in for long-term implementation. Particularly if you're working on private lands, you need that buy-in long-term. It is simple, but it doesn't happen. So building up community institutions who can, as Paula said, can take that information and project it, not in a necessarily adversarial way, but to say, understand what you're trying to do, but this is how it's going to have to work if you want this to be beyond a 1 or 2 or 3 year ribbon cutting. It's like it needs to sustain itself over time if we're going to make impact. Hope that's helpful.
Do we have a question from this corner of the room? I just came over here because I felt like we hadn't gotten questions over here. Okay.
All right. I've got a two-parter. First, I would kind of like to ask Paula specifically about the community watershed-based planning process and just how that's been going, what your barriers are, what your hopes are looking forward. I think in contrast to some of the top-down planning that happens in the government that's being talked about, watershed-based planning is like ideally a bottom-up process, but of course, as you all are saying, like one of the big challenges is maintaining the community-based group. So that's my first question.
Yeah, I'll start exactly where you ended your question, is how hard it is to sustain a planning effort at the grassroots level. Because if you're really truly committed to grassroots, that means you're dealing with volunteers and people that are very busy, and in the case of a disaster, traumatized and probably low income, So yeah, the big question is how do you sustain that? And I think there has to be some kind of level. Again, it's sort of that advocacy layer of capacity to really respect people's time and make the best use of their input and have like this intermediate track that just keeps going, because processes get derailed very easily if you're not careful. And with the watershed piece, it's especially tricky because, at least in our area, the scale of it is so daunting. We're dealing with, I can't remember the numbers now because I'm pulling a blank, but you're dealing with 17 or so major drainage basins. And it's more than that, depending on what watershed level you divide it up into. And we've struggled with this question all along. Who's responsible for healing the watershed? You've got Forest Service land and then a lot of private land. And should it be led by agencies, or should there be some other entity that steps in to do it? And right now in New Mexico, there's a process being established called a line of effort. And because we didn't know what to call it. And I say we, the collective, everybody, we like, okay, it's not a task force, it's not a leader, it's a line of effort. And somehow like we're gonna be in that line somewhere and not necessarily overthink who's in charge of a particular piece, because it's still in a formative place for everybody. You just want all hands on deck. And if we get too prescriptive about who does what too early, it's going to stifle people's initiative. So you've got a little bit of things that are maybe messy, maybe there's some overlap, but we're like, okay, knock yourselves out. There's room for everybody. There's plenty of work for everybody. But at some point, we're going to have to cohese around some unified plan. And it's still early, but there's a line of effort that has all the different agency land managers, and us as an advocacy group, we're kind of unique. You don't see a lot of that happening in the nonprofit sector. There just aren't a lot of nonprofits that are in this area doing this kind of work. And it's very challenging, but there is some work underway. But the weakest part is probably on that grassroots engagement. And I say that with a lot of, feeling like we're dropping the ball sometimes, because a lot of times we're given that homework like, hey, Paula, well, can you go have a meeting and round up like the acequias in this watershed and ask them about this, what we should do? And I'm like, yeah, we'll do that. And it's been like we're 3 weeks late, and doing that sort of work. But who's going to do that? Should the Forest Service do it, or should NRCS do it? And they're like, that's not part of their job to organize. But it's an organizing function. It's the relationship building piece that somebody's got to do. And the nonprofit sector is lacking capacity. And nonprofit sector means my organization is undercapacitated or whatever, under-resourced to do that. But that's where the real important work has to happen. But I do want to say that I'm impressed with the technical tools. And I don't know, somebody on the panel today, maybe it was you said we have so much knowledge, we have so much technology, but what's really needed is how we apply that in the world. And I am impressed with the tools we have available to us, but they're not being deployed to their full potential because of this capacity issue at the grassroots level, I think. But talk a lot about that. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Paula. I just saw a wrap-up sign there, I think. So as part of the wrap-up, at the roundtables this afternoon, number 6 gives you an opportunity to talk with this group further and explore this in much greater detail if you wish, or to explore some other features of it. So let's give Paula, Torri, and Brian a hand. Thank you very much. And none of us ever wants a disaster, but I think the message is do everything you can to prepare that web of existence between the community of life that we're all part of and the broader ecosystem, so that we're a little more resilient if it should happen to come.
One more round of applause. It's a great panel. Thank you all.